Frank Lloyd Wright, when he bought this land, there was no Scottsdale. Phoenix was just cattle ranches, just nothing but farms, ranchers, Wild West, the whole bit. He had set up a remote camp a few years earlier. He was going to work on a project, a hotel project, and to work on that project, he built a camp called Ocotillo, which is the name of a plant out here. And so then I think he got that experience camping, and then he decided, probably because he'd already been in the wilderness and tried it, he decided as a 70-year-old man to start a school out in the desert in Arizona. Profound desert where, you know, the water would often just come down off the mountain and wash them away. It was very intimidating. When the students come to school, they stay in a shelter in the desert. As you can see, they're very rustic. Many of them don't have walls. This one doesn't really have a roof because this roof is not waterproof by any stretch. So they stay in these shelters, college students, right? And so, for example, the students, when they arrive, they are given a shelter. They explore a little bit. Seniority, they get to choose, you know, with pecking order. And they find a shelter, and they have to live there from October to May in the elements, with no plumbing, with no electricity, very little light in this desert. We're out in 500 acres in North Scottsdale. And why do that? I mean, part of the idea is they'll learn about what's needed, like what kind of shelter is actually necessary to sustain life. The student that built this was experimenting several ways, and one of the ways was with heating, because the desert gets quite cold at night. And so the idea was to build a fire here, a robust fire, have it heat this platform, and then enjoy the residual heat throughout the evening. And the experiment was moderately successful. I mean, supposedly there was some heat, but it quickly dissipated, and that was that. And what's most curious to me is this. When I arrived here a year ago, I met this delightful woman. She had been a bachelor student, and she was finishing up her master's. She chose this shelter out of all the shelters that she could have had, because she had the most seniority. So she had the pick of the litter. She could have done whatever she wanted. And she chose this shelter, and as I was mentioning earlier, this would be the sleeping platform. And so she would just put her sleeping bag right here, and when it rained, since the rain would go right through this tarp, she would put a plastic tarp over her to protect herself. And that was her choice, and she really loved it. And you know what? This is actually my favorite shelter too, because it really asks you to think about what you really need to survive. The students find out, and they also find out that architecture can get in the way of experiencing your environment. And so you don't want to put up walls, or you want to put up columns that block your experience. And so I think our students are really sensitive to that after having lived in this way. That there's some privacy afforded here because there are other shelters and she wants privacy. But at the same time, things are framed very nicely by this canopy. And aren't these shapes interesting, and how it interacts with the landscape, how it's part in, part out, and at many angles. And it feels, to me, just like the desert that we were walking through. Okay, we're walking on the crust here actually, but, well, we're trying to be ginger. I mean, a little bit of trampling won't destroy. But it's when you build something and you really start to pull things up, that's the problem. It doesn't look rugged and like totally indestructible, and it just survives like 120-degree heat, and it can take it. And yet, if you look here, if we're off path, you see all the tiny plants that just kind of dust over all the rocks and over the soil. It's been referred to as a crust. It's very, very delicate, and apparently if you disturb it, it just takes decades to grow back. And for that reason, we have about 500 acres out here, but we really try to corral the students in where they build things because the ecosystem is so delicate. There's a saguaro for you up close and personal. Only found in the Sonoran Desert. And those just take decades upon decades. They get to be 200 years old. And so many things are quite delicate. Other things are robust and grow quickly, but nevertheless, we try to be careful. And so as you walk through this desert, you'll be surprised. I'm surprised. I'm always surprised. You'll just come across a structure. Okay, I've never seen this one before. Huh. No, the hanging's literally a tent suspended from a pole. So the hanging tent, it's completely suspended by a cable. Well, you have to take a ladder to get up to it, and there's a platform. And then you step off the platform into the tent, and it's just one big bed, basically. The concept was, there was a couple here. I believe he was the student, and I think she was the partner. And she said she was fed up with living on the desert floor, and that he better get her off the desert floor. And so this was his solution. I've been told it's really over-engineered. Like, it doesn't need to be that sturdy, but I guess to make everyone feel good about being suspended, that it's that it's not going anywhere. So we have a student, he's a master's student here from India, and he's been staying in there. And when I asked him how his time is going here, are you enjoying yourself? Are you having a good time in America? He loves that shelter. His eyes just light up, and he says that what's most amazing to him is he can lay in bed and look at the stars.
Is this kind of an alternative dorm?
Yeah. This is the dorm. This is under construction.
So all students build a shelter or work or help out with one, or?
Okay, right. So how does that work? Okay, so the students can choose to live in one like this that was built a long time ago by another student. And then they can choose to work on it, help with remodeling and rehabilitating. And that's often how they cut their teeth and then decide to build their own shelter. I love this one. It's when it was done, it was just nothing but benches in like a U. You can imagine it's just a big conversation pit, right? Just a huge conversation pit, and it all opens up. All these panels open up.
So this kind of circles back to what you were saying about what makes a shelter.
What's necessary for sustaining life. I mean, of course, they have access to a kitchen and a studio to work. But when you looked at the original camp, it was just white tents in the desert, and that's what Frank Lloyd Wright was working with. So the kitchen was a tent, the studio was a tent, his quarters were tents. And then slowly they built up more substantial things. And then they used each attempt to experiment. Now, let's not kid ourselves, this is very recent. This is well post Frank Lloyd Wright's death. This is what, I don't know, maybe 15 years old. But the spirit's still the same, where the students are experimenting with methods and materials, and from there, they are using this as a canvas. Is it about privacy? Is it about openness? They have to make a lot of decisions about that. Yeah. And a lot of them, of course, enjoy having a fire pit. That's, I guess, primeval, something about it. And not just because it's cold, but I think because they just enjoy it. That's probably a fire pit. Oh yeah, I can see there's coals. There's a grate. Yeah. The students are forced to live with the rhythms of nature. They have to wake up with the light and go to sleep with the night. In fact, one student was complaining to me. He found it really challenging that he would have all-nighters working on architecture projects, and then he couldn't sleep in because he's outdoors, and when the light would shine and the heat would add up over, he would be forced out of bed. Makes you industrious to have to wake up with the light. Some of these paths go back to the 40s. I mean, obviously Scottsdale really wasn't doing much at that point. So we have someone who lives on campus still, and she was raised in that compound of tent platforms, right? There's like 2 pads there, and you would put a tent on top, like a sheep herder's tent, and that's what she was raised in. Her mother was Cornelia Brierly, and she joined Frank Lloyd Wright in the 30s and was a leading player in his team and raised her children in this rustic environment. And the students, they swapped stories at the dinner table about, a javelina marched right through my shelter, a wild boar with tusks that aren't very nice. And they'll just, talk about the scorpions that visited them.
Wow, so that's probably the most basic shelter.
Crude.
Just a platform?
I think a lot of them are half finished.
Okay.
A lot of visitors that aren't students will say they want to live in a shelter and then chicken out. One student, he said that he was sleeping in his car the first week, terrified. Terrified he wouldn't leave his car. Of sleeping outdoors. This is what they're finding is essential, I guess, right? There's a fireplace, there's a bench. But students that have lived there say there's scorpions in there. And their theory is the scorpions get in and can't find their way out, which is why a lot of students prefer the ones without walls. See? Our walls can trap things in as opposed to keeping things out, is what they've discovered. But they also just love looking at, the quail and the rabbits, and so it's quite moving for them, I think. Isn't it amazing how these rocks just scatter across the floor? It's really gorgeous.
It's funny the patterns in nature, no?
Exactly. As Frank Lloyd Wright often said, just study it. Study how it does what it does. How does it create its structures, its forms, mimic them? They work. Obviously, they're successful and they evolved. So how can we improve? We just need to, in some ways, learn from it. Frank Lloyd Wright talked about architecture being musical. And I think that if a building was out of sync with the environment, it would be like a cacophony of sound. It would be jarring to the ears. So Frank Lloyd Wright was very sensitive to cost with his own buildings, so he just used whatever was around, both at Taliesin and Taliesin West. And so too, it is likely to be harmonious with the environment. The buildings should complement nature. It should complement the landscape, not fight against it. It should be as if it tumbled out of or arose out of the landscape. The building shape itself and the way it's situated on the land should be an organic outgrowth of that land.
This is so opposite of a city. Did he have much to say about city versus rural living? I know the Broadacre.
Absolutely, yeah. Broadacre, there you go. Where in his ideal model, you wouldn't have the kind of density that we have. You might have a high-rise, and he designed in his Broadacre city a high-rise, but a single one, so that every apartment had an unencumbered view of the countryside so you can engage right in nature. Even though you're in a high rise, you can see all around you. And so you stay totally in touch with nature. And he went into detail in saying things like all the power lines need to be underground. You know, he really was into the aesthetics of engineering the whole thing.
Yeah.
Do you see those power lines over there? That happened in his lifetime. They put up these power lines. And so he reoriented the whole campus away from those power lines, because before it was looking out over the valley. And then he was so outraged that he then turned the orientation of many of the buildings to go toward the McDowell Mountains. I want to be clear, our students do their own work totally irrespective of what the work that Frank Lloyd Wright did. But it's still interesting to have people around that were aware of the traditions. So here is Victor's shelter that he did while he was a student here. Victor is now the dean of the School of Architecture, but he was a student in the early 80s. Might be closed up for the summer. You know, Frank Lloyd Wright also read voraciously. He quotes often from various philosophers, be it Whitman and Emerson, Lao Tzu. So too, I think he studied nature just the way he studied literature, and took a lot out of it and then put it into his buildings. And so that's why at the school we teach a lot of humanities. This one is interesting. It has a glass box with a solar array. So here's someone who said, okay, I'm going to live in the desert, but I'm going to create a box with a solar array, because they weren't as comfortable with the concept of, you know, being all in the elements. It has that clear story, and it has that kind of feeling of a floating roof. And then they did this mitered edge here. So here a student was really playing with Wrightian elements of design, like that whole vocabulary. It's good of them. They were experimenting, they were playing with it. Who knows what they're doing now? Probably something very different. But at least they, just like when you're a student of any discipline, you play around, you mimic, you take elements, and then you find your own voice and your own style.
I'm curious about cost. Are there limits? What do the students?
They're given $1,000 by the school, and then they're encouraged to seek out funds, donations, help. That's part of what we hope they'll learn, to find ways of, you know, scrambling to get resources and then recruiting people to help them.
And if it's small, you probably don't need as much. You're getting maybe remnants or...
Yeah, and you get what you can. So you work with what you have. Concrete's expensive. They're always seeking out donations of concrete. And then to experiment with material and hopefully upcycling material. So finding material and finding ways of repurposing it. And I like that there's this candle stuck here in the wall for practical reasons, because otherwise how can they come out here at night? But also, what a beautiful way to live. You know who came out here? Martha Stewart was out here a couple months ago. She was just delighting like a child. And we have to keep in mind that she's a very mature woman. And yet, something about this brought out her sense of play. Curious. It's you know, people from all walks of life find this attractive, even in this hostile environment. We're nomads, right? Is that what it is? We just want our little camp. We want a shell, you know, we want a cocoon. One thing you will not miss, and is obviously the focal point of living out here, are the sunrises and the sunsets. And right now it's just kind of moody. I don't know what kind of sunset we're gonna get. Here, sunrise and the sunset are life confirming, I'll tell you that. That dominates life out here. someone once suggested that was visiting here, actually a neuroscientist from Berkeley, who said she wanted to come out and just hang out with us. So she worked in the kitchen and just kind of experienced the campus and the place. And she said, oh my gosh, they're really going on, what did she call it? Like the dream.
Vision quest.
Vision quest, thank you, vision quest. It's happening whether you want it to or not. It's really profound for them to be out here in these elements, in a private way, in a secluded way. I find this desert in particular very grounding and very purifying. So there's something very special about it.